What's going on, everybody? It's Sam Nasher in the Whiskey Somm here, and I'm really excited to be talking today with Mr. Will Schragis, the national, sales manager and kind of lead brand ambassador type dude for Barrell Craft Spirits. A lot of you guys probably know them from Barrell Bourbon, and you can see the logo in the background that we have set up, the Barrell Craft logo. But they actually do make more than just bourbon. They do have a rye, which is this one right here. Before we get into the liquid too much, Will, I want to talk a little bit about you and your background, if you don't mind.
Not at all. No, please. I've been with Barrell for almost 6 years now, but previous to that, I moved into the retail and auction world, and I worked for a wine retailer called Schragis in New York. And it was there that I actually first met Joe. I was the spirits buyer, and he came in when he was launching Barrell, like Barrell Bourbon Batch 1.
Oh, wow.
And we got along really well. I think Schragis was like the
25
third
now.
store. Yeah. Third store to have it. And we stayed in touch, and I went to work for Spirit Bomb after that. But Joe and I always sort of stayed in touch. And finally, when he was ready to move nationally, he got in touch with me and said, I want this to be a national brand, and I'd like you to help grow it. And as at the time, 26-year-old, it's like a dream job. And so I've been working with Joe ever since, and it's amazing. It has flown by. I think about now we've gone from 6 to 46 states. We started with just me and Joe and Joe's daughter and Trip working for the company, and now we're up to 24, 25 employees.
Wow.
We went from just batches of bourbon to now we have batches of bourbon, batches of rye, single barrels of bourbon, single barrel Canadian rye, single barrel Indiana rye, infinite barrel project, vatted malt, Dovetail, private release bourbon, private release whiskey, private release rum batches, Tale of Two Islands, BCS rum, BCS whiskey, BCS bourbon.
Let's start tasting too, shall we?
Yeah, sure. I have the rye poured, although I'm happy to pour something else if you want to start.
We can start with the rye. So let's talk about the rye. So Barrell doesn't distill anything currently, right?
That's true. We have a fully licensed distillery in Kentucky where we do all of our blending and bottling and finishing. However, we really believe in partnering with distilleries around the world, making things that are greater than the sums of the parts out of ingredients that are produced by other people. And so we want to be very transparent about the fact that we are not distilling, but we also want to make sure people know that we're not contracting out our production to anyone. We work with, as of recently, 74 different distilleries around the world. And so
you're doing sourcing in a different way. Instead of sourcing to, release as barrel whiskey for, ever and ever and ever, you're sourcing from partner distilleries to create similar but unique products.
I think in the world.
And when I say similar, I mean, like batch to batch, you can be slightly similar, but there'll be variations.
Yeah, everything we do from a whiskey production standpoint is built on two foundations. The first is that we produce everything at cask strength. So there's never any water used in our production. The second is that we are concerned with making the best thing we can at every moment. We are not at all concerned with making the same thing. And so when you are blending, if your target is consistency, you have to leave a lot on the table in terms of intricacies and improvements, even if they're available to you, because you're hitting the target of the thing you made the last time you blended. And for us, the target is always what is the best thing we can produce at that moment. And that creates a lot of compliance problems. It creates a lot of work for me and the rest of the sales team in terms of explaining the changes and turning things over however many times a year. But it also means that we're always, we think, at the forefront of what flavors can really be put together within a bottle of cask strength whiskey. And every month I get to talk to people and I have a new thing for them to try, which is not that it's necessarily a new batch every month, but there's always something new from us. And that keeps the job fresh for sure.
That's cool. So approximately how many, different distilleries go into this particular batch of rye?
So this batch of rye, off the top of my head, is 4, maybe 5 distilleries.
Okay.
When you work with Canadian rye, there's more than one giant distillery in Canada, and they trade barrels with each other quite a bit. So the places that you're sourcing from are not necessarily the places that it was distilled. But there is definitely one distillery in Poland that we work with, and there's MGP in Indiana that is, of course, in here. And then we've worked with rye from a couple of other distilleries around the country as well. So this is a minimum 4-year, the oldest being 14 years in here. And the 3 main components are the 100% malted rye from Poland, the 14-year-old Canadian rye, and then a 4 and a 7-year-old Indiana rye, the 95.5 mash bill that they use.
Now, I don't have a lot of experience with Polish rye, period, especially not, Polish malted rye.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain for me, as well as, the viewers, what really one should look for with a Polish rye?
I don't think there's anything particularly to look for, because when you're talking about expected profiles, you really can only talk about categories of whiskey that have a lot of competition and a lot of history in them. Polish rye is not a category that has a canon that we can stick to. But this particular whiskey is made like a single malt Scotch. So it's very much what we would call a beer ferment. So it's fermented slightly longer, slightly more carefully than something like a bourbon ferment would be. And it's out of 100% malted rye. So there's a lot of that cereal-y quality and also just a lot of flavor development. Malted grains in general just have so much more enzyme and flavor in them. And then it's double pot stilled the way that a single malt Scotch would be. So that ingredient is technically a single malt. It's just a single malt made out of rye instead of barley.
Sure.
And it's done to a pretty high proof, and so it works really well as an ingredient, although it's a little bit abrasive by itself. But it brings a graininess and also a sort of almost tropical fruitiness to the whiskey that you don't so much get in the really like lemony, appley Canadian rye or the sort of dilly, spicy, oak-driven American rye.
Apologies, I'm listening to you, but I'm also starting to, dig into this. I see what you're talking about there. I do get some of that dill and, spice of the American rye in there. But I also see, a more, I don't necessarily want to say fruitiness because, it's partly power suggestion, but it's a lot more open, kind of. Whereas American rye is kind of tight and shut. This feels more open.
I think this rye, the reason I love it so much is American rye is such a wonderful category of whiskey, but it's also one that does not afford very much creativity as a distiller or as a blender, partially because of the rules about barreling it. It has to be 100% new oak. And because there's not that many people that are producing it well. And in America, for the most part, ryes are made in a very factory-esque setting. There's not a lot of sort of well-known or mass-produced
harder
rye.
to work with, too. So, bourbon producers aren't going to be like, oh, I want to make a rye all of a sudden. And, it takes a lot more time.
And some do, but a lot don't. And a lot of people, it messes with their equipment when they do rye. That being said, I also feel like rye is a grain that has so much to give in terms of the flavor it brings to a whiskey. The goal in blending this was to take all of the things that we love about American rye and blend some ryes that have a little bit more distillate quality to them. And so the Polish rye, of course, for the maltiness, but the Canadian rye for the fact that there was no new oak on it. It really pairs it back. It's almost like a leaner, more restrained, more pinpointed style of whiskey than you get in American rye. Now, I get all the things from it that I am looking for in more classic American styles of rye. All of the sort of herbaceousness and like sort of wintergreen, or like what I often get is like lemon basil or pineapple basil, the slightly fruitier styles of basil. And then the baking spice qualities that you get from rye a lot, the clove and the mace.
The cardamom, the cinnamon.
Yeah. But poking through that to me is that sort of honey quality and the green apple quality that you get from the Canadian ryes.
Absolutely.
Especially because even though they're not the dominant character, they are a higher proof when they're coming in. And so their noticeable flavors, especially on the nose, really like pop through the rest of the whiskey.
If you wouldn't mind, tell us a little about Infinite Barrel, since, that's just it's such a neat idea.
So the Infinite Barrel project is an ongoing project that we have. It started as a 2,000-gallon blend of 9 whiskeys from 4 different countries. And we're up to 19 whiskeys from 5 different countries now. And the idea was we wanted to have a whiskey that was always available. It was before Dovetail. It was when we were only doing batches before that. But that was antithetical to the idea that we always want to blend to be as good as possible. So what we decided was to create an ever-evolving project, one that we were always trying to improve upon slowly, bit by bit. We only ever bottle at most 10% of the vat or the barrel, the Infinite Barrel, at a time, which, full disclosure, it is not a barrel, it's a stainless steel tank that we wanted to have as much control as possible. So we keep it after it's vatted in stainless steel. We bottle 10%, and then we try to improve upon it with either the same ingredients or older versions of the same ingredients, or occasionally we introduce small amounts of new ingredients to it. So it's very much a world whiskey. It's hard to sort of place it in the world of whiskey because the only blending styles that it's really that similar to are one random old Samaroli release that existed for a while, and then some of the stuff going on in Japan. And so even though it's our least expensive product, it's not really an entry-level whiskey. It's kind of a intermediate to advanced level whiskey in terms of you really need to like peculiar whiskeys for it to be a whiskey for you. It has a little bit of peat. It has a lot of malt character, but it's much more full-bodied than what you'd find in a Scotch or an Irish whiskey. But we really like working on it because there's no comparables to it. It's just like what we like and how we can make it better.
It's, thing with most distilleries is, all right, here's what we have. Here's what we had before. Can we improve upon this?
Mm-hmm.
And, some places are like, it's perfect, done. Nope, not touching it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of boring. It's like, come on, why not try to make it better?
Yeah, I think a lot of the products that exist in the world in the alcohol industry are really wonderful for what they are, but they're very much identity products. They're things that you drink because you identify with the brand. And so the idea is not to take steps forward. It's for those brands to either innovate with new whiskeys or new products, or to give people what they want from an identity standpoint. And our brand identity, the reason people like us and the people that we're looking for to drink our whiskeys, and the reason we make whiskey, is we always want to be tasting and looking for the new thing. And we want people to look to us to taste and look for the new thing. And so even though a lot of the lessons we learn stay true, like ring true through a lot of our products, none of them are ever supposed to be the same. They're supposed to be, you liked our perspective on what was going on and what we were able to make, and you're excited for the next thing that we make as well. And it makes this a little bit hard to follow sometimes, but I hope that our portfolio of whiskeys actually feels somewhat cohesive because it's the same, like Joe, the owner and founder of the company, is still the person that says yes or no before anything leaves our facility. It's like one person's idea of what good whiskey is still governing the entire body of our portfolio. And we feel like we have some brand identity because of that, even though it's not just the same whiskey year after year or month after month.
So let's shift gears, if you will, and let's talk about the Bourbon Bash 25, because that also just came out.
Yeah, Bourbon 25 is really exciting to us. It's the first time we've ever used a wheated bourbon in one of our batches. And so it's a much brighter, sort of more floral bourbon than we normally do. I liken it to a lot of our bourbons that rely on really old stock. I think of as almost like impressionist paintings. They really flow flavors in and out of one another. A lot of things will be in the front palate, and then you'll lose them in the mid palate, and then they'll come back in the finish. Bourbon 25 to me is a bourbon where there's 5 or 6 or 7 really specific notes, and they're very identified, and they're sort of in line next to each other the whole time.
I get a little bit of barley.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of malted barley in several of the mash bills that are used in it, but there's everything from high rye bourbon to wheated bourbon to some really corn forward bourbon. I don't think anything has more than about 8% malted barley in it, but it's not so far out of what you'd expect from a classic bourbon, but it certainly gives you at the same time flavor profiles that you don't normally see next to each other.
There's a candied corn sweetness, but not candy corn.
So sort of corn forward and like caramely.
Not quite caramely, more like spun sugar cotton candy sweetness.
Yeah. You ever had a Crunchy, the Cadbury bar?
I actually don't think so.
It's next time you're in a place that has English chocolate bars, like a nice grocery store or something, there's one called a Crunchy, and it's got this like kind of honeycomb.
Oh yeah, I have had that.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is reminding me of a Crunchy bar, and I never thought of that with Bourbon 25, but I kind of want to track a Crunchy down and have it with, see if I find that same flavor.
Ooh. Now that you start talking about, that chocolate honeycomb, I'm getting cocoa. Like, hot chocolate powder that didn't fully get dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of marshmallow. Kind of that creaminess. So while I open this up, talk to us a little bit about Dovetail, please.
So Dovetail to me embodies as much as anything we make sort of the spirit and the idea of what Barrell Craft Spirits wants to be as a producer. It is a whiskey that is always a blend of the same 3 ingredients, all of which we do the finishing of ourselves. But we always blend those 3 to taste. And so the proof of it changes and the color of it changes a little bit each time we bottle it, but the flavor profile is always the same.
So this one I have here is 124.34.
Yep, and I am drinking one that is 125.24.
You lucky bastard.
And so it is always a blend of Indiana whiskey finished in Dunn Howell Mountain Cabernet barrel, or Dunn Cabernet barrels from Howell Mountain. They make 2 wines, Howell Mountain Cabernet and just Napa Cabernet, and we use both barrels from both. Dunn is one of the most sort of oldest, well-respected producers of Cabernet in the country, and they're a family-owned company too. And we trade them whiskey for their barrels. It's a partnership that we really hold very close to the heart. It is, though, if you add all the batches together, bourbon is the top-selling product we make. But as a single product, Dovetail is the most popular thing we make.
That is amazing. So, Will, I know you're short on time. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I love whiskey, obviously, but I love talking to, more independent, smaller, craft, even if you will, family-owned producers of, whiskey and other spirits, because that's, anyone can go out and buy a bottle of Maker's Mark or a bottle of, fucking Akashi White Oak Japanese whiskey. But, there's, what I'm trying to say, and I'm not saying it well, is that I appreciate and respect the smaller, more independent producers as much, if not more so, than the big guys, because I'm assuming Joe did this by his bootstraps, more or less.
Yeah, I think that Joe knew what he wanted to do going into it and had enough connections that he was able to get his hands on stocks to make good whiskey quickly. But there is room in the alcohol producing world for all different types of producers. And
absolutely. And I'm not saying that there aren't. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the big guys.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I love supporting the smaller guys and talking to the smaller guys as well.
I think what is nice about working for such a a company that is so small in its team, but so big in its reach is that I still get to be part of every part of the process. And I wouldn't get that if I worked for a really big company. So I appreciate you saying that because it makes the job for me much more enjoyable as well.
Mr. Will, cheers.
Yep. Cheers.
Until next time.
Until next time. Thank you so much.